Thank you to be with us. I believe you saw us on the keynote session earlier today. So I'm not going to go too much about presenting us, but I will make this presentation with Mark. So the idea today is to talk into more depth about 3 case studies where we will, we've been choosing cases that we have been encountering a couple of times in banking or finance industry generally, meaning insurance. And these are the 3 we are going to talk about. Enabling omni-channel strategy, which is #1 issue that banks are facing, especially retail banks. Secure self-service with partners. This is really general. This morning we talked about, integrating the ecosystem, leveraging services outside your own enterprise when you are an FSI company. This is what we will talk about. And service orchestration as well as monetization. This morning we highlighted the need for linking with enterprise services. The question is how to innovate on that and how to monetize. This is what we will go through. So let's jump on omni-channel strategy. And a little bit of background. In order to illustrate what we are talking about, I will talk about the e-billing, e-bill presentment and payment. So if we step back a little, you know that in Europe we are going to comply to the PSD2 regulation. This comes after the PSD1, which highlighted new regulated companies, the payment service providers. And you all know, I believe, that the PSD, generally speaking, has been set up by the regulation in order to open the box to make players in banks or in the banking sector to have the ability to address specific pieces and specifically payment as a loan, while other pieces or other services like credit and loans or others could be dedicated to other banks or other players. PSD2 came, you certainly know why. It came mostly because of the risk for banks or payment service providers of a PSD1 taking risks in the place of initiation of payment players, and that's why third-party players are going to be defined by the PSD2. It also opens the door to opening the services the bank can provide to the ecosystem, generally speaking. So hence, what is going on here in UK around the HMT, the Open Banking API regulation that is going to come, which goes even further than PSD2. So what is nice with this is that when thinking of payment, which is really becoming a commodity, there are new process, new schemes of doing payments that makes maybe more sense for the end customer, but also for the corporates. And this means that eventually when we talk about, omni-channel strategy is how from a end customer having his mobile at his fingertips through the smartphone, how does this happen? So if we focus on the customer, here is an emission, This morning I talk about the Holy Grail. So it's a joke, but not really a joke. It's really what finance industry players are looking for. How to provide your own services to the end users, and in which situations. So instead of pushing forward your enterprise or bank product, how do you cope with the real life of the customer so that you provide right on time, at the right moment, in the right situation, the service you are providing? So if you imagine from a front end, from an end customer perspective, what it is the e-bill presentment and payment. For a quick question, who know about e-bill presentment and payment? Okay, so who don't know at all? Okay, so I'm going to explain a little bit. You know, in the PSD, there have been a couple of means of payment that has been set up in the SEPA world with the credit transfer and the direct debit. Okay? The idea of the e-bill presentment and payment is to provide the ability through specific standardized scheme to the end customer, the ability to present a bill or a bill or you know, an amount to pay to somebody in order to secure the validation of the payment by this end customer so that it goes directly to the corporate, the payee, through either a four-corner model, banking model, or three-corner model. The idea being that there are different schemes or standards that can emerge in order to make this happen. So basically, from the customer perspective, you can get bills that you will receive from your bank that, depending on the scheme or the standard, will have been presented by a payee, and you have the ability to either to pay or, depending on the standards that will be put in place, delay a payment, so put a date when you want to pay, maybe split the amount in various pieces, so that from an end customer perspective, it's nice, it's still electronic payment, it's no more a check or anything like this. You have your hands on the payment itself. It can use and leverage easy and cheap means of payment like this SEPA credit transfer in the SEPA world. This is all it is about. Now the question is, and this is exactly the drawing I am talking about here, is that when you have, imagine you are this guy, Mr. Bruno, let's say. This is Bruno in the weekend. I'm not in the weekend today. I should have been, because when looking at some of you, I will change my suit next days. Anyway, when you look at Bruno, he will get, you know, on his mobile banking or on his mobile, a set of invoices. He has the ability to accept, reject, ask for detail, put on hold. Obviously, the various features that will be here will depend on the scheme that is behind in the e-bill presentment and payment standard. There are a couple of invoices that he will accept because he knows that he has to pay every month this bill on for his mobile or for electricity or for an insurance or whatever. But he may get an invoice to say, oh, I need to look at it when I'm back home. So he will open his web banking, he will look at it and check with a couple of papers, maybe accept from his online banking. And obviously, he will, at the same time, he will see that this has been updated on his mobile. But on a couple of those invoices, he may ask, well, I don't understand this one, or I was expecting an invoice, but the amount is not what I was expecting. I need to call the call center. Okay, and the call center can elaborate based on what they do have. So in such a simple situation, you know, and eventually, he can accept or reject the payment. In this case, he is accepting. Anyway, in such a situation, we very well understand that all these actions happens on different physical channels, can happen at different localization, can happen at different time in the day. The call center need to be synchronized with the rest. How do we make this happen? This is what a piece of the omni-channel strategy that needs to be put in place. Okay, how APIs are helping to solve this issue. Here what happens. behind the scene, let's imagine in one region, a scheme of e-bill presentment and payment scheme has been adopted, like the one of my bank that you certainly heard about. Who heard about my bank? Nobody heard about my bank. My bank is a scheme for starting with e-bill presentment and payment, which is put in place by the EBA AIB Association, so the Association of European Banks. There is another one on e-billing and payment scheme, which is put in place in France, named CEPAMEL. Bad name, but it is what they've chosen. And there are others to come. I mean, this is the magic of SEPA, and this is the magic of the PSD directives, or payment service directives, not only the number 1, but also the number 2, so that to open e-services on top of of these layers. Anyway, back to this. In the core system, from a banking perspective, you do have settlement or payment engine. You do have account management. You do have all the customer care services. And, well, we imagine here that there is a payment initiation services or microservices that has been developed. What the API is providing is it's providing a first layer, which is making the connectivity and taking care of the security to address those different channels, so the mobile, the online web, and the call center. This layer is leveraging the catalog of API that you find here, okay, which is an exposure of various microservices which are behind the scene here. When we do this, and I think we presented this general schema in the keynote this morning. When we do this, we provide the ability to work on the hard stuff, like the standards, the process, like the payment initiation, and make sure that from a customer-facing, a user interface perspective or user experience perspective, we can have the agility to make the orchestration of those services in front of a customer being done, and at the same time to make sure that the context, so through this one API, we can share the context across the various players that are involved. So various players being applications or being also call centers. Any question? So let's move on case 2. And Mark, do you want to present the case? Case 2, this is around self-service partners.
Exactly. So what I'll do is talk about the importance of self-service with APIs, and I know that it's quite a technical audience, so feel free to ask for any technical info on how these things are done. As Bruno was talking, I have an example of setting up OAuth security for a particular API that I can jump into if there's questions on that. So one of the things that's important about APIs that was mentioned in some of the keynotes and then the panel that I was just on was make it so that people actually use the API. So you want to have the documentation, examples, test in place, all of that in place for your APIs. So what we see is that in financial services in general, for example in insurance, as an example here, you want to make it as simple as possible for people to onboard. So let's say that you have a service where your customers have a choice. They will often make that choice based on how easy it is to set up the connection as a developer. There's obviously a lot of different payment services available. So to make that connection in insurance, we've seen this for a while where insurance companies go to market indirectly through brokers, through for example, with My Data here in the UK, where you can compare insurance rates between different insurers, it's then important to make this onboarding as straightforward as possible. So here you can see part of this is having a portal, an API portal, partner portal. For people familiar with older ways of doing integration, it has a lot in common with onboarding for like file transfer and other more established ways of doing integration. So that means that you have a gateway in place to provision new partners. These can be for B2B. These can be as well, of course, for APIs. Challenges involve that it's not just a great big flat list of partners that you're onboarding. You might have different SLAs for different partners, gold, silver, or bronze, even with developers as well. So you might have a particular SLA with a gold customer in place where you want to make sure that that's in place. So that the connection then, I'm going to walk through how this is done, and then rather than video, I can show some of this in action if people are interested in that. But the key thing is that you want to be able to have a different experience depending on the categorization of the developers. You want to be able to have those to be brought then into the ecosystem. And you can see that one thing about Axway is we link in the file-based integration, often done still for payments and settlements, host-to-host integration for many major banks around the world, along with APIs. So you're doing that onboarding, the management side by side, because often it's the same organizations that you're dealing with in the new API way as you were in older ways of doing integration. So here's kind of literally the big picture, but like API management has been mentioned a lot, and really I don't think there's anything like Axway specific here. Like, it's not too much product placement, I think. But when people talk about API management, there's a number of different moving parts involved. So the piece that's most visible is this piece up here, the API portal. So this is the piece where you want developers to learn about your APIs. You want developers to get the API documentation. We'll see shortly to do like test in place for your APIs, to be able to quickly get all the information they need to actually use the API without having to go back and deal with support or ask questions. So the API portal could be used by internal developers, or it could be used by third-party developers. There's a good point made on the panel just now that a lot of people that you're evangelizing the APIs to might be in a bank or in your company, and you want them to use it. In some ways, the API portal is the modern-day equivalent of SOA registry repositories for people who remember the days of SOA, still ongoing in some places, but they involve kind of just foisting WSDLs on developers and saying, here's the WSDL, take it or leave it. With APIs, you have a much more rich experience in terms of test in place, getting documentation, signing up. So the developers could be internal developers or external developers. As Bruno was saying, to tailor this to the financial audience, you can see that our developers here are wearing suits and ties. Not a normal thing for application developers. But the thing here is you have the other side, which is the back end of the portal. So this is something that's used by what's sometimes called API administrators, API owners. Sometimes these people are like API product managers. We have some customers who now have that role, an API product manager. We've seen that become a thing. And these people are managing the life cycle of the API. So the API has a new version, you push that out. You might be pushing the new version out to just certain categories of developers. You might be applying an SLA. You might be saying, this API, we want it to be accessed by these developers. These other folks, we don't want them seeing the API. Let's say you ask a third party, for example, with one of our customers, they're using Infosys to develop a mobile application for them. So they will say, well, the Infosys developers, they can see these APIs because they're going to need these APIs to develop that app. The other APIs, we don't want them to even know they exist. So that's what the API administrator is doing. It's behind the curtain of the portal. And then the piece you'll see with really a lot of the vendors in this area is the gateway. So the gateway is the sharp piece of the architecture doing the policy enforcement. If you set up a policy here saying, we're going to throttle the API usage to like 1,000 requests per client per second, the gateway is the traffic cop that's actually enforcing that. So it's seeing the traffic. Really, if people are familiar with the area of like SOA gateways, my own background, as a founder with Fordell, XML gateways before that, these things used to be usually appliances, pizza box type 1U appliances. That's moved on. Now they're generally software, VMs in Docker containers indeed. So what that means is you can scale out much more easily than waving a magic wand and creating a new appliance. So all of this together is API management. So it's the promotion of the API, the management of the API, the security of the API, all of that together. And I think sometimes people just see the outward-facing piece, the portal. They don't see the gateway. Or indeed, if someone's coming at this from a security side, they see the gateway, but they don't see this other piece. So you really have to see a full view. And again, there's nothing too Axway specific here. This is all the pieces you'll see with a lot of vendors in this area. And indeed, doing the SOAP to REST conversion. Mark Boyd mentioned that the survey that was done in the run-up to this event asked banks, do you have SOAP or REST? Do you plan to throw out the SOAP and move to REST, or do you plan to instead have a REST interface in front of SOAP? There was a view that what people throw out all the SOAP and put REST in front, but pragmatically what a lot of people were doing was putting a REST interface in front. So one of the simple things the gateway does is it does this REST to SOAP. It creates like a virtual REST service in front of SOAP. But to Arnaud from AXA's point, including the design of that, so you're not kind of creating a kind of soapy REST or roast as he put it. Yes. Yep.
You mentioned the scenario of insurance and banking and pensions.
Yep.
There's potentially a number of channels, like retail, there's
Mm-hmm.
intermediaries, for example. There's also employees or agents.
Yep.
They all need to be able to, their applications need to interact with the API.
Yep.
They're being authenticated using different user directories.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to kind of layer on something like, I'll talk about API gateway, but actually the underlying user stores could be different and the API can make sense of that?
Yes, it is. And in fact, the one of the key criteria for an API gateway is what it can connect to, because nobody wants to create a whole new user store just for their APIs. That's leads on to another point, that a lot of, when you look at API management vendors, a lot have come at it from a kind of pure cloud deployment where it's something kind of up on the cloud, so that the APIs, the clients connect to the cloud, and then there's somehow a kind of backhaul connection to on-premise, but your user IDs are all up on the cloud. We've seen people move away from that model because it can get out of hand. What Sailesh from Lloyd's was saying, if you do have hundreds or thousands of apps and many users, then you suddenly have this whole user store. So what we do is we will link to, obviously, Active Directory, different directories, things like SideMinder, RSA Access Manager, Oracle Access Manager, Ping Identities, Ping Federate, you name it, all these things. So the key thing is to not have this as an island. And the same goes for monitoring. People already have the likes of ArcSight, they have Tivoli monitoring, they have Splunk, they have all sorts of things already in place. So to be able to send the monitoring to that as well. So that's maybe the missing piece around here is all of the connectors. So I think that's often again, without being too Axway specific about it, but when we are in competition in terms of API management platforms, one of the big things is do you guys connect to all these different identity stores? And I think you also mentioned OAuth. OAuth is also very important as well in terms of not only doing the initial authentication and the issuance of the access token based on an existing identity store, but also sometimes interfacing with other systems with OAuth as well. So I mentioned Ping Identity. Ping Federate is often something that's out there, but other systems that use OAuth, and indeed when you have a client coming where they're authenticating with another system. So we have one large mutual fund management company close to where I live in Boston has an OAuth implementation, but one of the things they do with our gateway is that they allow people to authenticate through Salesforce and then connect in. So in that case, our gateway is getting the OAuth access token. We're checking, basically, do we trust this? Do they have the scopes? So that also allows that type of interop. But yeah, that's a very good point. I think it can't be an island, because then if it's an island, it's just a science project, and then at some point you have to rip it out and actually link it into your systems. So as I mentioned, the developer self-service is important. This is a screenshot from just a sample. We have a sample API portal up at developer.axway.com that we use ourselves, but you want to have this sign up button so people can sign in. But the key thing about that as well is it doesn't have to be an immediate sign up. You might have a approval process in place. I think something that's interesting about financial services and banking APIs is that in the API world, like when we do APIdays conferences and general API Day conferences, you want people talk about using the portal so you can get from 0 to hello world, as they say, in like 10 minutes. So you find the portal, you sign up, you're using the API in 10 minutes. With financial services, it can be a little different. Like if this API is transacting money, if there's customer information being passed and so on. So there's often an approval process in place as well. So we build that into the system. And indeed, there might be regulations that mean that you can't use this API from where you are. You have to be in a particular jurisdiction because of regulations. So these are all things to take into account in your policies as well. The other thing, this is one of the points I was making in the panel, is like it's one thing to put out an API, but you also have to have what developers expect, which is this type of nice, in this case using Swagger, but this type nice way that you can do testing in place for your API. So not only do you see, oh, this API has this interface and there's my parameterized URL, but you can test that. You can put in the parameter. You can try it. You can drill into it. You can see, here's my JSON response. If it's not working, you can see why it's not working. It's got a simplistic example, but if we had applied OAuth to this, you can also automatically generate the OAuth access token if you put in your keys, your OAuth credentials. So the key thing is to have developers be able to get up and running with your API without having to go back and engage support or kind of ask questions. So in this case, I think, again, I am, from a vendor in this area, but this type of thing is table stakes. It's something you'll find that, developers will be asking, you guys have an API, do you have a Swagger interface to it? Can I do test in place? And then the harder question is, if your API is protected with OAuth, can you do test in place that will mean that you can auto-generate the OAuth access token? But again, kind of table stakes, but you'll find like if you don't have this in place, then in a commodity type area, people will go somewhere else. If they have to use your API, then they might complain about ease of use. So this is active documentation, whatever you want to call it, but it's something that I think is important. The other thing is, without getting into the religious arguments, that there is still a lot of SOAP out there. So, SOAP gets kind of bashed over and again at conferences like this for good reasons, but still, there are a lot of SOAP services out there. And even if you look at I mentioned the Dun & Bradstreet example. So they're one of our customers that uses us for their API. If you look at their API portal, you'll see there's the whole SOAP interface there. SOAP has a place. So like in insurance, for example, if you look at Accord, if you look at some of the patterns in insurance, let's say you're submitting a claim. The claim has attachments. They might be photographs. They might be documents. SOAP has a nice model for SOAP attachments. Often these are large messages. It's interesting that SOAP, because of the usage of XML, tends to be much larger than JSON. But as you have like a lot of information in the message, they kind of converge. And the thing with XML is you do have a lot of existing standards out there. I mentioned Accord for insurance and others. So it's something that hasn't gone away. And I think, without taking a religious point on it, to be able to support both is important, especially if you already have SOAP services. And so what we've done in Axway is we noticed that people really like the whole test in place model for REST. And one of the things that might be why API portals have taken off so much more than the old style registry repositories is because you have this self-service model and the test in place. So we apply the same model to SOAP. So it's kind of restifying applying those types of best practices to registry repository. Here's your auto-generated request. Here's your headers. Try it out. Send it through. Check your response. You can do all that kind of stuff there as well. So it's funny because when we work with customers, there's often this kind of sheepish thing that people say, well, we still have a lot of SOAP services, don't tell people, but it's still out there. So the key is to support both. Of course, at the API gateway, you can convert between the two. I think what we do advise against is trying to go too much the other way. We have people saying, well, can you use API keys with SOAP and things like that kind of don't make sense because you have already WS security in SOAP to do that. But I think the other thing, it's almost worth a whole workshop on its own, but with SOAP, there's a very well-defined security model, the WS security standards. You might have seen I wrote a whole thick book about them, and there was enough material there to write a whole book about them. With REST security, you wouldn't have the thick book. It'd be, much smaller in terms of what people are doing out there. It's the joke is the Wild West, but there's a lot of Wild West type security going on with REST, and it's important to have policies in place at the API gateway that protect from, simple things like API key replays. And a lot of APIs are vulnerable to that. So with that, I'll hand back over to Bruno, but happy to answer any technical questions people have.
So the last case I would like to share with you is about service orchestration, and we'll end up around analytics for monetization. The case is quite simple. This is something that has been sometimes presented, but I would like to go behind the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is what? It's when you are a bank and you want to be more proactive to your customer and provide personalized loan for people looking for home loan. And the example is quite simple. You have again Bruno visiting somewhere. I think this is in the US around Phoenix, but you will get the slide so you will see. This Bruno is looking at a house, and he is well known by his bank, and he's wondering, well, how would it cost? The idea is, the idea is very simple. He logs in to his bank. He is identified per his location because he will have provided the authorization to be localized, and then you get a number. You get, well, this home will cost you €1,431.76 per month. That's as simple as this. But what it is, the idea is to have something which is really personalized to this home for this Bruno, knowing his habits, what he is doing, the level of risk the bank is associating to him, and so forth. And end of the day, the idea is really for the bank to leverage their own services, account management and homes and loan services. So what happens, in fact, behind the scene? When Bruno is logging in, he logs into his account management. And then what happens is that in the backstage, a couple of external services that are, connected to get information. Localization is one, which is quite obvious. Another one, which is real estate estimation, so that when it comes back to the information system of a bank, then this information can be bundled together with the scrutinization of the customer, assessment of his risks, assessment of his habit, how does he work and how is it known, how well is he known by this bank, so that the proposition of loan that can be provided to Bruno is perfectly adapted to him, and is certainly the best price he can get. And this is the objective of a bank. Now the question is how to do this in a way which is securized, where the Bruno's information, personal information, is not going to be leaked, to be stolen away by somebody outside on the web or on mobile. How can this happen? Obviously, APIs is helping here. And remember the model we are working in? We find exactly the same three levels like what we have described so far. In terms of access, well, I'm not going to expand a lot. We have talked a lot about this piece so far. What is interesting here is what happens here. You find two major services that the bank is providing is this legacy system, like the ID management. We talked about ID management earlier today. And the loan services. But this is not enough in order to deliver the service that is expected at the end, at the tip of the fingertips of Mr. Bruno. We need to connect to these services which are external, and at one point of time it might be one service, it might be another one. For example, if I look at real estate cost services, there are different services like this depending on countries, depending on where we are. So there is a need to make a connection between the localization itself and the service to be requested, and then it shall be bundled here in order to be presented to the end customer, but it shall be used and leveraged in order to fuel the scrutinization of the account on the one hand and of the real estate on the other end in order to provide the service. So this is a real architecture that we are using, leveraging the different capabilities that Mark went through just in the previous presentation. So, having said that, I would like to go through a bit of monetization or enabling monetization, because we are talking a lot around monetization. You know that monetization is an old word, actually. Monetization comes from, I think it has been invented in 1932, something like this. So it's really an old thing. And you can monetize many things. We are talking a lot about monetization of API, which is a monetization of a usage of the API per se. And this is particularly important when building business models in the programmable web. But this is not the only thing that needs to be done when thinking of monetization. And when you guys are thinking of monetization, you need to think about what to monetize. What do we have to monetize? And here I have a challenge. In a way or another, a bank either will will serve a couple of services to the external ecosystem, or will use partners in order to provide the service. Whatever happens in either situation, everybody will have to manage the service level agreements, and maybe eventually, depending on the business model, will monetize. So the challenge here is that we talked this morning about, digital as being, opening the door to the world of uncertainty. We don't know where we are. Gartner presented us a future in 2020. We don't know really what will work, what will not work, and for a very simple reason. We are all part of an ecosystem, and the value comes from the ecosystem. And who knows what will be the good service that will hit, the ball. Which will it be? How you will monetize this thing. What is important is to know what is used, and not only the data itself. I mean the localization here of the amount of money that I'm going to borrow to this Bruno when I am a bank, or what is the number of contracts that I'm going to sell through a partner when I'm an insurance in the case number 2. What is also important is how often, who is using what, from which geography. These are the metadata we are talking about. And this metadata may be very important. Remember in something like 20 years ago when telco went open, went breaking down the monopolistic positions they had in countries. Remember all the new business models that happened when on the mobile you had the right from this time to this time or during the weekend to have double or triple the number of minutes you could consume for the same price, or reversely, between 12 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you could consume much more units of your contract than during the weekend. All that sort of things. These business models comes from the, let's say, the creativeness of the marketers. So when we talk about monetization, we need to provide enough data in order to fuel the various protein business models that we can imagine. What we do think is that we need to show, we need to have, in X way, because we are, in the management of data flow for, we've been there for 25 years, something like this. What we see is that there are 3 levels of data and information that can be leveraged in order to fuel monetization or billing engines. There is obviously the technical layer, how much the API or which API is used. In other words, which service is used by whom, from which geographies, at which rate per time, blah, blah, blah. This is more of a technical layer. There is a link to metadata reporting. When you cross all this different information, suddenly you can have a better idea of how your services are consumed, how they are used, and you can identify alert. So from an operational perspective, it provides you valid information in order to act. But from a monetization perspective, that's very interesting. It opens the door to, or it opens the mind to specific ways of thinking of how you can provide or which business model you can provide. And then the last layer has more to do with monetization itself, which is how do we, or can we translate all this, let's say, usage information that we can, analyze across various, let's say, axes. How can we translate in some business models? What does that mean? And more importantly, when you provide such approach, how a new business model or new approach would impact what we can think about. So obviously we need to, at the root, manage the API consumption, but what more importantly is what are the services we are using, what are the data we are using, which data makes sense or can make sense depending on the value that the business guys in your companies will look at this usage. And having the ability to monitor this information at the business level as well as the metadata level or technical level is really helpful in opening the mind on these things. Why I'm sharing this is that the first time we presented our capabilities to do this kind of things, to banks, I realized how powerful it was to kind of provide this synthesized approach of information to open the creativity or the innovation of the marketing guys. So we do think that this is really helpful and needed in order to enable monetization. So, in a nutshell, this schema has been presented, so I'm not going to go through again it. I think Mark presented it in the earlier session. What we presented today in this, high-level view of the use cases, we went through enabling outbound between, let's say, the legacy, which is quite stable, generally speaking, and what is needed by the market. And on top of this, presenting how we can enable or provide information to enable monetization. Tomorrow, before tomorrow, well, this is a summary of the various pieces I just explained, so I'm going to go quick on that. Tomorrow we will go into more detail, and you know what? This cafe workshop that we are presenting, and this will be Rick and Philip who will present that to you, is more in the other sense. Today we've been talking a lot to you guys. We want you to think and to ask questions so that our session at the cafe and the workshop will be as much as interactive as possible. The idea being to go deeper in all these pieces that we have been presenting to you. So, the other workshops is what we usually do at Axway. Any other question? Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So on the Omni-Channel aspect, you're showing the layers and how you can then access the APIs to the different channels. But if someone is moving between mobile and then desktop online and so on, how do you manage the state transition? Where would the state of the process that person might use when going through be held?
Actually, do you want to take
maybe I can answer that at a fairly technical level. One of the things we embed in our gateway, the API gateway, is like Cassandra, basically in-memory database that can be spread across gateway instances. That allows you to have the session state being available across the different types of interfaces. For example, if you look at our website, I know it's not financial services, BMW, it's one of our customers, they have different ways that you interact with the car, and that's also using Cassandra for the session state. So it's a matter of ensuring that when people move between interfaces where they're engaging ultimately with your APIs, that they're not basically losing information. So like, let's say you've called out to look up attributes of that user, you're not doing that a second time. But also you might want to know what path they've already come through. So especially if you're using more hypermedia type APIs, there's a kind of a path there in terms of what they've already done, and you want to basically flow that through, so you're not kind of sending them back to the start again. So it comes down to having as much as possible at the server side, so you're not relying on clients to somehow like store the session up there and send it down. It's more at the server side, and it also links into associating that with OAuth access tokens, so they don't have to log in again when they're going between. And that can even be between. We had interesting conversation yesterday with one of the banks here, but it can be even between apps that are on the same phone of the same user. You also want to be able to manage the session across those two. But you're doing that at the API layer.
In the gateway.
In the gateway, yeah. One more question. Yep.
You had 3 case studies, thank you very much for them. What's the reason for not showing any like real-world banks or financial institutions applying this? Is it that it doesn't exist? Or is it
sometimes they don't want to have their name used or kind of talk. You might notice we've kind of mentioned a few, but the example I used of the kind of architecture with the 3 speeds, that is from a large bank, but again, not every bank wants their architecture to be showing up on a big screen at an event like this. But I think where banks are happy to see success stories, for example, is around things like hackathons. I mentioned we're sponsoring one coming up for UniCredit later on this year. Things like that I think are what banks will often share. But that's the main reason. There's also historically with banking that one of the large Axway customers that I work with has a very sophisticated digital platform, including Kafka, including Cassandra, with Spring containers for microservices. That's IP for them. They don't want other banks, taking photographs and saying, "Okay, we'll do that." So there is some, know-how there as well. I think that's part of it.
At the same time, there are a couple of customers that we can cite that we have authorization for, like the NAB, National Australia Bank. We are leveraging our API. We will not disclose how and into more detail, but they are using our API approach and suite and gateway to fuel their digital strategy. There are also a couple of success stories that you will find on our website, like Storebrand here in Europe. Maybe you know these guys, or Cetrel, which is the market infrastructure for cards, payment cards, who are really leveraging our solutions. This is available. This is okay to talk about. No problem.
I will add to this. It's the reason why we had to make an API days on banking and finance APIs only, because at the other event we often have a finance track, but like banks sometimes didn't want to come just for one event that was not worthing enough for just to attend. But they don't want anybody to tell their infrastructure to really be sure that the thing, and most of the time they have an embargo on what can be said. So this is why we make an event like where we say, okay, we'll make an event on banking, so come and explain it yourself. And because it's in London, because they're all here, this is why they accepted, and this is why we have this event. But yeah, so I know as a vendor, most of the time they say no, never say don't use our name and see our architecture, even for security reasons sometimes. Yeah. So
this is also reinforcing the fact that API are really strategic, and the architecture around API are really considered as strategic for a FSI player. This is also why we cannot share everything.
Thank you very much, Pierre and Mark.